Again, good morning to all of you. Today we begin our new collection number two. Collection one is already behind us. We already explored two very important elements of literature, which are plot and setting. Today we're going to move to another important element, an essential element of literature, which is character. Remember that the elements of literature are essential and are vital because you cannot have literature without these elements. You cannot have story without plot. You cannot have story without setting. You cannot have story without characters. As a matter of fact, story is about the characters. So the entire collection, this collection is going to be pretty short, will be dedicated to this particular element, to characters. Before I move on to characters, a quick reminder. I made a discussion of the book report protocol, how it's supposed to be done last Friday. Last Friday, we did not meet. I met with the other two groups, but the lesson has been recorded and the lesson was uploaded to my YouTube channel. Character is an essential element of literature. So let us define what a character is. I'm going to give you a couple of definitions on character. So you can have a well rounded idea of what character means. We can define character as a fictional construct. A character is a representation of a person in a narrative, dramatic work of art, such as a novel, a play, or a film, or a short story. Notice that we define the character as fictional. If it's fictional, it means that it's a product of what? Let's word it differently. If it's not based on facts, it's based on what? On the imagination. Very well. It's based on the imagination. That let's use the language. Let's use the terms that are more precise because a character can feel very real when you're reading him. So saying it's not real objectively might be true, but subjectively it's not. That's why I'd rather you use the word imagination. It's a product of the imagination. Now, why am I stressing that it's a product of the imagination? Because sometimes you're going to read stories that have real historical characters. Have you ever read a story where Abraham Lincoln is there? Anyone? Well, in seventh grade, when we used to teach literature in seventh grade, we don't teach literature in seventh grade anymore. We teach writing. There used to be a story by Ray Bradbury called The Little Drummer Boy. Well, the drummer boy in the Civil War, and how he was nervous about going to the battle. I think it was the Battle of Antietam, one of those horrible battles from the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln was like walking around the place and had a conversation with him to make him feel better, right? To encourage him. Also, a few years ago, there is a novel that appeared called Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Killer. And they even made a movie of that. And Abraham Lincoln is like a ninja. And he's like, he kills vampires. And usually the vampires are Southerners and slave owners. And the Civil War happened because most of the slave owners in the South were vampires. And I tell you, this guy flies through the air and he cuts them into pieces. And he's a ninja, which Abraham Lincoln is fictional. The Ninja Vampire Killer. This is Abraham. It's funny. You never heard of that novel or that movie? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but it's real. I wonder if it's in the list of books. But that they took a real person and they filtered him through the imagination, and they turned him into something else. He's not the Abraham Lincoln of history like the one in the other narrative. So that's why we're stressing here that if you have Abraham Lincoln saying things that really came out of his mouth and he's behaving the way he really behaved, then that's not a character. We're representing a real person. But when we filter one of these characters or make up one and filter that person through the imagination, that's a character. Okay, it's a fictional construct, not a real person, but a character. Uh, we can also define character as a person, persona, identity, or entity whose existence originates from a fictional work or a performance, like in a play or something. Such existence is presumed by those participating in the performance as audience, readers, and otherwise. When you're reading about a character or when you're sitting in a theater watching a movie or watching a performance with actors, you know that that actor is not, or that character is not a person that exists in an objective reality, but still you feel for that character. There is something called suspension of disbelief. Instead of saying, "Oh, I know that the bad guy is chasing her," but nothing real is happening. You know that's all fake. It's all fictional. Is that the way you watch movies and read books, or do you suspend your disbelief and you tell yourself, even if it's unconsciously, I'm going to accept this person as real, even though I know this person is not real, so I can enjoy the story. Yes, that's the way it happens, right? We sit there, and you're chasing the girl, and you're screaming here. And you know she's an actress, and that she was paid money to run and scream and make it look like she was gonna be killed by a bad guy. But you push that aside because if not, then you cannot enjoy the story. Characters are not only human beings. In addition to being people, they can be aliens, they can be animals, they can be gods, they can even be AI, artificial intelligences. Sometimes they can even be inanimate objects. How many of you saw Beauty and the Beast? So you know what I'm talking about, right? I was saying that famous characters from the world of fictional prose and drama, from Annie Sullivan to Zeus, from Golem to Mickey Mouse, from Iago to Superman, reveal much of what the human spirit is capable of. They say a great deal of who we are and who we may become. That's why we are so inspired by characters. That's why they are so real to us, because we see ourselves in many of them, and they reveal things about ourselves that sometimes we don't know. That's one of the satisfying things about reading, guys. Okay, let me share some famous characters of fiction with you. For example, in the genre of action adventure, some famous characters include Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes, Ian Fleming's James Bond, and Hua Mulan from the ancient Chinese legend. In comedy, famous characters include Shakespeare's Falstaff, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, and Major E. Henderson Buell's Little Lulu. Anybody have you seen Little Lulu? The cartoons? No, I used to see that when I was growing up. Little Lulu. Yeah, famous cartoon. In crime fiction, famous characters include Frank Miller's Carmine the Roman Falcone, Mario Puzo's Don Vito Corleone from The Godfather, and Patricia Cornwell's Kay Scarpetta, a detective. In fantasy, famous characters include Stephen King's Ronald Deschain from the Dark Tower series, George R. R. Martin's Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones series, and Robert E. Howard's famous barbarian Conan the Cimmerian. In Gothic horror literature, famous characters include Lovecraft's Cthulhu, Koji Suzuki's Sadako Yakamura from the Ring series, and Stephen King's Pennywise the Clown. In mystery literature or detective fiction, famous characters include Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, not Enola Holmes, and Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. In political fiction, some famous characters include George Orwell's Winston Smith, the protagonist of 1984, and Ayn Rand's Dagny Taggart from Atlas Shrugged, and Joseph Conrad's Nostromo from Nostromo. In romance, famous characters include Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre from Jane Eyre, Jane Austen's Elizabeth Bennet from Sense and Sensibility, and Emily Bronte's Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. In science fiction, uh, famous characters include Robert Heinlein's Lazarus Long, Frank Herbert's Lady Jessica Atreides from Dune, the greatest science fiction novel ever made, and Alan Moore's Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. In thriller fiction, you got Jack Ryan from the Tom Clancy series of novels on Jack Ryan. You have Stieg Larsson's Lisbeth Salander, the hacker from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and Dan Brown's Robert Langton from Demons and Angels and The Da Vinci Code. And those are only some of the famous characters that you probably heard of some of them. Now, I'm going to introduce, guys, a concept that is not in the book, but I believe it is very important for you to understand character and that we need to discuss here. And that is the concept of the character archetype. You know, a character may be based on a particular archetype, which we define as a common characterological pattern, like those listed later on. Archetypes are modeled after mythology, legend, and folk tales. Okay, what we're saying here is the following: characters are based on archetypes. You can look at an archetype as a prototype. And somebody tell me, what is a prototype? Yes. For example, let's take your father or mother's car. How did that car come into existence? Well, first of all, someone thought about it and they doodled. They were doodling, they were drawing, and they drew it, and that was the car of their dreams. Maybe an engineer from Ford. Let's use Ford Motor Company. So this engineer went to his boss, his supervisor, and look at what I drew. And there's the car, and this can be the new Mustang for 2025. It's going to be electrical. It's going to have this, that, and the other, all kinds of features. And the boss saw that and probably said, interesting. Let me take this to my boss. And he took it to his boss, and his boss liked it, and his boss took it to his boss, and at a meeting, they saw that idea and said, you know what, let's run with it. So they go down the chain of command again, and the boss tells the guys, the engineer, the team of engineers, let's make the car. And after a few months, they make the only car of that type in existence. There is no other car like that one. That is the only one. That is what Ms. Recio was calling a prototype. And they start tweaking with it for the next few months, and they're loving it, and they're hating some things of it, so they redesign them. And finally, they end up, after a lot of tests, with the version that they want. They have more meetings, and they're going back and forth, up and down the chain of command, until at last they have the prototype that they want. But there's only one. What are they going to do? They're going to use that one as the model. And in the assembly line, that's going to be the model for all of the other cars that will be made in the assembly line while they're mass producing it. And the ones that end up in the showroom and a dealer near you, was made following that prototype. I mean, it's a gross oversimplification. What I just gave you was a very gross oversimplification, but I'm using it to illustrate what I mean here. Well, look at an archetype that way. It's like a cookie cutter for characters. All characters are based on an archetype, the same way that all cards that you see out there on a road are based on a prototype. Another example I could use is, how many of you have ever played with Play-Doh? You know, Play-Doh, clay. Okay. My children, and I used to play with Play-Doh too when I was a kid because Play-Doh has been around for a while. And I remember that sometimes I would buy for my son or for my daughter. And I remember my daughter had one that was like McDonald's, the McDonald's set, and it had a bunch of molds. And you would take the clay and you would shape it like a burger patty or hamburger buns or like a piece of lettuce or like onions or like a piece of tomato. And you would like use a specific color of clay, put it in the mold, squish it, and you would end up with as many patties or tomatoes or buns as you wanted. Did you ever have one of those? You can look at character archetype that way also. They are models, they are molds, they are prototypes, they are patterns for characters. Archetype, as we said, is an original model of a person, is an ideal example or a prototype after which others are copied, patterned, or emulated. It is a symbol universally recognized by all, and they fulfill a particular role in a story. They have a function to serve the story. And the archetypes come from what we call the monomyth. The monomyth is the original story because we told you once that all stories come from one original story, the monomyth. And that's where we originated the archetypes, okay? So let me give you a list of the archetypes and let me explain them to you. Let's begin with the most important archetype, the hero or protagonist. You can call him hero or protagonist. Who is this character archetype? The driver of the story. When I say the driver of the story, imagine that the story is like a car and it moves forward. Who moves the story forward? The protagonist is the one that moves the story forward because the story is about the action that the protagonist takes. And remember that any protagonist is involved in a conflict, and what's their responsibility toward the conflict? What do they have to do? It's a struggle, it's a problem. So what do they have to do? Solve it. They have a problem with you. Guess what? You got to solve it. Every story is about someone has a problem, so they have to solve it, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, right? That's the worse it gets, the more interesting the story, right? You know that. So the hero protagonist is defined by two things: by pursue and consideration. Pursue what? Well, usually a character wants something, and the problem is that they cannot get it because something is getting in the way. I want to survive, but a monster is chasing me. I want to pass the test, but it's going to be very hard. I want to ask her out for the party, but I'm too shy, and also the big bully from school wants to ask her out also. You see how this works? The hero is always pursuing something. In the case of Katniss, what is she pursuing? Katniss Evergreen in the Hunger Games. Survival? Because that's the way that you win the Hunger Game. The last person alive is the one that wins. So she's pursuing survival. She has to stay alive. And the conflict is that, well, there are other people trying to kill her, right? Because that's what the Hunger Games is about. So, in addition to pursuing what you want and having forces keeping you from or pushing you back from getting what you want, which is what causes the struggle and the conflict, you have consideration. The main character usually finds himself in a position where he or she have to consider. And what does it mean to consider? Well, you consider all the time. When you go to McDonald's, don't you stand in front of the menu and decide, oh, what do I take? The Baconator or the Big Mac or whatever. or the chicken nuggets. You have to make choices, and usually in stories, main characters have to make moral choices. So that's what defines them. Another character is the opposite. Another character archetype would be the shadow antagonist. And this is the character that is opposed directly to the protagonist. And what defines this archetype? Something called prevent and something called reconsideration. Prevent what? If he's against the hero, what is he preventing? Exactly, exactly. The hero wants this, but the shadow's in the way. The antagonist is in the way, raising hell, right, causing problems, and also reconsideration. The hero has to consider. Let's take Eve in the Garden of Eden. She's walking around and she sees the tree that God said you cannot eat from that tree. And a serpent appears and said, "Why don't you eat from that tree?" And she told the serpent, "Well, no, because God said that if I eat from that tree, I'll die." Really? Responded the serpent. Really? Are you getting that? It's making her like, wait a minute, I made this choice and he's giving me another option to disobey God. Luke Skywalker, he wants to kill Darth Vader because Darth Vader killed his father. No, you killed my father, right? No, I am your father. No, you know that, right? You saw that. You know what I'm talking about. Reconsider. And now, what are you going to do? You had this plan that you were going to kill him because he killed your father. And no, 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 that's not what happened. He's your father. What are you going to do now? Reconsider. So, that's what the antagonist is always doing. He's always raining on your picnic, right? Another archetype is the mentor or guide. This kind of type of character is a teacher and a helper that aids the protagonist through help and conscience. Like, for example, every time that Bruce Wayne goes out dressed as Batman at night in Gotham City to fight criminals, and he comes back busted, who's the guy that patches him back, that sews his wounds and cures him? Alfred Pennyworth. So what is Alfred? The mentor, right? He's the one that patches him back. He helps him, and he's also the conscience, the voice of conscience. Sometimes the hero is tempted by the villain to make the wrong choice to obtain his goals, but the wrong way. And the mentor is there to remind the character, the protagonist, what is right and what is wrong. Like a coach, right? Sometimes you're in a team, in a sports team, you're doing the wrong thing, and your coach tells you, no, that's the wrong way. This is the right way. Another archetype includes the ally or the sidekick who is unfailing in its loyalty and support toward the protagonist. What characterizes this character is something called support and faith. He supports who? The hero. And he believes in the hero. That's why we say that faith is one of the um, components of this archetype. Who comes to your mind when we say sidekick? Robin. Every Batman has his Robin, right? Frodo Baggins has his Samwise Gamgee, right, in the Lord of the Rings. He's the guy that sometimes has to carry you, support, literally carry you, like in the Lord of the Rings. Return of the King, you see that Samwise takes Frodo. Frodo can't take another step anymore, and he puts him on his back and he carries him. He's there to help you. He's your buddy. He's your buddy. He's your best friend. We also have the Herald. The herald is defined by something called catalyst. What's a catalyst? They taught you in chemistry that a catalyst is anything that creates a chain reaction. And the herald is here. Usually, a herald is someone that announces, right, that something is going to happen or someone is coming. Like the Silver Surfer here. Galactus is coming. For what? To eat your planet, because Galactus likes eating planets. And of course, there come the Fantastic Four. They're going to fight against Galactus to save Earth, right? So they set the story in motion, basically. They appear very early in stories, the catalyst. Another one is the guardian contagonist that hinders and deludes the protagonist on his way to achieve his goals. and they are usually defined by hinder and temptation. Look at this character this way. You know that when you play games and you have different stages, and there's a big boss at the end of the game, but there are smaller bosses in each section of the game, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like, oh, I ended this part, but now I have to kill the boss. I have to fight with the boss so I can get to the next level, right? Same thing here. That's what happens with the Guardian antagonist. We also have the shapeshifter that blurs the line between being an ally and an enemy. Uh, who comes to my mind would be Catwoman, right? Sometimes you don't know if she's friend or foe, and they provide a combination of appeal but danger. You're never like sure what's going to happen with this type of character. And then you have the trickster, who is the fool. They're usually funny. They usually inject humor into a story, and they question everything. They rebel against the established order, and they are also defined by catalyst and comedic relief. Who comes to mind? Loki and Thor, and my favorite trickster of all has to be Bugs Bunny. He's the trickster. Bart Simpson is another trickster. The Pink Panther is another trickster. The Joker is another trickster. We also have character categories. We are done with the archetypes. And we basically have two types of character. They can be either dynamic because they change, and they can also be static because they never change. When I talk about change, I'm not talking about cosmetic change that they change their hair or they change their clothes or their style. I'm talking internal changes. Like, for example, this character was irresponsible, and now he learned that with great power comes great responsibility. Now he's responsible. Like who? Yeah, exactly. If you saw a movie called Spider Man from 2001, you know that the reason why his uncle died is because he was not very responsible. He felt guilty. He did not use his power correctly, but then he went through a series of events in the story where he learns to be responsible. He learned that with great power comes great responsibility, and he changes. So that's a dynamic character because at the end he was not the same Peter Parker. The one that began was not the same one that ended. Now you have characters that are always the same; they never change. Like this guy here, you know that guy, right? Who's that guy? Homer Simpson. And Homer Simpson will always be the jerk that he is, right? And then we also have another way of categorizing characters. We can say they are round or that they are flat. A round character like this one means that they are realistic, they are well rounded. This guy, who is he? Anybody? Who? Tony Stark, Iron Man. Why am I saying that he's well rounded? Did you know that in the comic books, he is a recovering alcoholic? Did you know that? So if you have a guy, are there people in the world that are recovering alcoholics that struggle with that, with alcohol addiction? Yes. If we present a character like that, will it look like realistic? That he's not perfect. He has flaws. So that's what a round character is. They have flaws and they are very realistic. But you have characters that are flat. They're like caricatures, like Wiley Coyote. They always do the same thing. He always makes the same mistakes over and over again when he's chasing the Roadrunner. He's an idiot, and he never changes. He's always flat. Like he's always like chasing the Roadrunner. There's nothing else he does. He's not a very realistic character. I mean, I enjoy him, right? But he's not realistic. And again, and finally, characterization is the process of creating and developing a character through a work of fiction. And we present characters. We don't tell you what characters are like. We actually show you what they are like by showing them to you through their actions and their thoughts. You know, you make opinions on people based on what you see because you cannot get inside people's minds and hearts to know them. You know who people are by their actions because our actions define us. The same thing happened with characters and stories. We see what they do and how they act, and we arrive to conclusions of who they are. So, guys, this is what I have for you today. There's an assessment. Remember that it has to be uploaded to the LMS. And I'll be seeing you in a couple of days. All right? Take care. Goodbye.